The autumn moon hung full and luminous above the stone balcony of Westmorland House, casting silver shadows across the weathered flagstones where I stood that fateful night. My name is Lord Cedric Harrington, Duke of Westmorland, 32 years of age, and in all my years of diplomatic service to the Crown, nothing had prepared me for the moment when I would touch the hand of a woman accused of treason and feel my entire world shift beneath my feet. The crisp October air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from the village chimneys below. I had returned from France only a fortnight prior, my mind still heavy with the political machinations I had witnessed at Versailles. King Louis's court was a nest of vipers, each smile hiding a dagger, each whispered conversation potentially altering the fate of nations. I thought I had left such treachery behind when I crossed the English Channel, but it seemed betrayal had followed me home. Rosalind Ashworth. Even now, her name sends a tremor through my chest. She had served faithfully in my household for 3 years, a woman of quiet grace whose intelligence shone through despite her humble station. At 26, she possessed a dignity that transcended her circumstances, though she bore a small scar on her left temple that she kept hidden beneath her white linen cap. I had noticed it only in fleeting moments when wisps of her dark hair escaped their careful arrangement. The accusation had arrived with the Morning Post, sealed with the official stamp of the Crown's investigators. Sir Bartholomew Cromwell himself would arrive within days to collect the traitor, the letter proclaimed. Miss Ashworth stood accused of passing sensitive information about my diplomatic missions to French agents. The evidence, they claimed, was irrefutable correspondence found in her modest quarters. I remember standing in my study that morning, the parchment trembling in my hands not from fear, but from rage. Rage at the impossibility of it all. This was the woman who tended my library with reverent care, who had once wept openly when she discovered mice had damaged a rare manuscript. This was the woman whose eyes lit with genuine curiosity when I spoke of my travels, who asked thoughtful questions about the political tensions brewing across Europe. My steward, Marcus Whitmore, had been the one to discover the alleged evidence. A man of 60 years who had served my family since before my birth, he appeared genuinely distressed by the revelation. He stood before my desk that morning, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his grey eyes reflecting what seemed to be sincere sorrow. "Your Grace," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of years, "I searched her quarters myself upon receiving the anonymous tip." The letters were hidden beneath a loose floorboard, written in her own hand. "They detail your meetings with the French ministers, information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of your affairs." But something felt wrong. Perhaps it was the years I had spent navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy, or perhaps it was something deeper, something that refused to accept that the woman whose presence brought such unexpected comfort to my days could harbor such deception. I found myself seeking her out that very afternoon, ostensibly to question her about household matters but truly to observe her manner, to search her face for any sign of guilt. She was in the great hall, arranging fresh autumn flowers in the massive stone hearth that had warmed my ancestors for centuries. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, catching the golden highlights in her brown hair and illuminating the concentrated expression on her face as she worked. "Miss Ashworth," I called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned immediately, her hands smoothing her apron in that unconscious gesture I had noticed she made whenever she was nervous. "Your Grace," she replied, offering a curtsy that somehow managed to be both respectful and graceful despite her obvious anxiety. I approached slowly, studying her reaction. "How do you find the household running since my return from France?" "Very well, Your Grace," she answered, though I noticed the slight tremor in her voice. "The staff has maintained everything precisely as you prefer. Mrs. Henley in the kitchen has been particularly careful with the menus, knowing your fondness for the French preparations you described in your letters." There it was again, that reference to my correspondence. But rather than seeming calculated, her mention felt natural, born of genuine attention to detail and care for my comfort. I watched her carefully as I posed my next question. "Have you had any correspondence yourself recently, Miss Ashworth? Perhaps from family or friends?" The color drained from her face so completely that I instinctively stepped forward, fearing she might faint. Her hand went to her throat in a gesture of pure panic, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever evidence existed against her, she was innocent of the crimes alleged. "Your Grace, I write only to my cousin Margaret in London," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She is my only living relative, and I sent her news of my situation here. Nothing more, I swear upon my father's grave." The anguish in her voice was so genuine, so raw, that I felt something crack inside my chest. This was not the practiced deception of a trained spy. This was the terror of an innocent woman who sensed the noose tightening around her neck. "Your father," I said gently, hoping to ease her distress. "Tell me about him." Her eyes softened at the memory, though tears threatened at their corners. "He was a scholar, Your Grace. Thomas Ashworth, tutor to several noble families before his death 5 years past. He taught me to read Latin and French, insisted that knowledge was the greatest gift he could provide. When he died, the families he served offered their condolences but little else. I was left with his books and little more. This revelation struck me like a physical blow. She could read French. She would have been capable of writing letters in that language, letters that could be misinterpreted or worse, deliberately altered to appear treasonous. The pieces of a more sinister puzzle began forming in my mind. "Miss Ashworth," I said, my voice taking on an urgency I could not conceal, "I need you to think carefully. Have you written any letters recently that mention my travels or my work?" She nodded reluctantly, her hands twisting in her apron. "Only to Margaret, Your Grace." I told her how proud I was to serve in the house of such an important diplomat, how fascinating it was to hear about the French court and the delicate negotiations for peace. I thought it would ease her worries about my situation to know I served a master of such honor and distinction. The innocence of it, the simple pride in her connection to something greater than herself, nearly brought me to my knees. In that moment, standing in the golden light of my ancestral hall, I understood that Rosalind Ashworth was not a traitor. She was a woman whose crime was nothing more than loyalty and admiration, whose letters to her cousin had somehow been twisted into evidence of treachery. But understanding her innocence and proving it were entirely different matters. Sir Bartholomew Cromwell was already en route, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency was well known throughout the realm. He would arrive, collect his prisoner, and see her hanged within a fortnight. Unless I could uncover the truth and expose the real conspiracy that was unfolding beneath my very roof. That night, as I stood on my balcony staring out at the moonlit countryside, I made a decision that would change the course of both our lives forever. The decision to investigate the matter myself was not one I made lightly. As Duke of Westmorland, my word carried considerable weight, but challenging an official investigation from the Crown could be seen as treasonous in itself. Yet as I stood there in the moonlight, watching the shadows dance across the grounds my family had protected for generations, I knew I could not simply surrender an innocent woman to satisfy political expediency. The following morning brought grey skies and a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the manor. I summoned my steward, Marcus Whitmore, to my private study under the pretense of reviewing estate matters. The room smelled of leather and old parchment, familiar scents that usually brought me comfort but now seemed to mock the gravity of my situation. "Marcus," I began, settling behind my father's massive oak desk, "I need to examine the evidence against Miss Ashworth myself before Sir Bartholomew arrives." His weathered face showed no surprise, though I detected a slight tightening around his grey eyes. "Of course, Your Grace. I have secured the materials in the strongbox as instructed. Shall I retrieve them?" Minutes later, he returned with a small wooden chest containing what would determine Rosalind's fate. Inside lay 3 letters, each written in a delicate feminine hand that I recognized as hers. But as I read them by the flickering candlelight, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The letters detailed my private conversations with French ministers, including specific mentions of trade agreements that had not yet been made public. They described my personal observations about King Louis's intentions regarding English colonies, information that could indeed be considered sensitive to English interests. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong about the documents before me. "Marcus," I said carefully, "you mentioned receiving an anonymous tip about these letters. Can you describe exactly how this information came to you?" He shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar gesture. "A note was left in the kitchen sometime during the night, Your Grace. No signature, but it specifically mentioned checking beneath the loose floorboard in Miss Ashworth's quarters. I felt duty-bound to investigate immediately." "And you found these letters exactly as described?" "Yes, Your Grace. Hidden away, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. It appeared she had taken great care to preserve them." I studied the letters again, this time focusing not on their content but on their physical characteristics. The paper was of good quality, better than a servant's wages would typically allow. The ink was uniform throughout, suggesting they had been written in a single sitting rather than as correspondence over time. Most telling of all, there were no creases or wear marks that would indicate they had been folded and sent through post. "Marcus, have these letters ever been sent?" "They appear remarkably pristine for correspondence." His pause lasted a moment too long. Perhaps they were copies, Your Grace. Some people keep records of their correspondence. But I knew Rosalind's circumstances too well. She had no money for quality paper or multiple copies of letters. Moreover, her personality was too direct, too honest for such duplicitous planning. These letters were forgeries, but proving it would require catching the real culprit. That afternoon, I made an excuse to visit the kitchens, ostensibly to discuss menu arrangements for Sir Bartholomew's impending arrival. The kitchen staff bustled about their duties, but I noticed how conversation quieted whenever I approached. Mrs. Henley, our head cook for over 20 years, seemed particularly nervous. Mrs. Henley, I said gently, you've been part of this household longer than most. What are your thoughts about these accusations against Miss Ashworth? The portly woman's face flushed red as autumn apples. Your Grace, it's not my place to question the authorities, but I've never known that girl to be anything but honest and hardworking. She often helped in the kitchens when her other duties were complete, never taking extra food without asking, always grateful for any kindness shown. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Any strangers about the property, perhaps? Well, she said hesitantly, wringing her flour-dusted apron, there was a gentleman caller about a week past. Said he was looking for work as a groundskeeper, but something about him didn't sit right. Too well dressed for a man seeking manual labor, if you understand my meaning. This was the first I had heard of any stranger on the property. Did this man speak with anyone in particular? He spent considerable time with Mr. Whitmore, Your Grace. They spoke privately in the courtyard for the better part of an hour. I only noticed because it seemed odd for the steward to spend so much time with a prospective groundskeeper when we weren't in need of additional staff. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in my mind, forming a picture I desperately hoped was wrong. Marcus Whitmore had served my family faithfully for decades. The idea that he could be involved in such treachery seemed impossible, yet the evidence was mounting. I decided to confront Rosalind directly that evening, both to warn her of the danger she faced and to gather any additional information that might help me understand what was truly happening. I found her in the small servants' hall, mending linens by candlelight. She was alone, which struck me as unusual, as the servants typically gathered together in the evenings for company and conversation. Miss Ashworth, I said softly, not wanting to startle her in the dim light. She looked up immediately, setting aside her needlework and rising to curtsy. In the golden glow of the candles, I noticed again how the small scar on her temple caught the light, a reminder of whatever childhood accident had marked her. She had told me once, during a brief conversation in the library, that she had fallen from a tree while retrieving her father's hat during a windstorm. Even then, she had been protecting those she cared about. Your Grace, she said, her voice carefully controlled but unable to hide the tremor of fear beneath. How may I serve you? Sit, please, I said, gesturing to the chair she had vacated. I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer with complete honesty, no matter how strange my inquiries might seem. She sat slowly, her hands folded in her lap, watching my face with those intelligent dark eyes that had first captured my attention years ago. Of course, Your Grace. The letters you wrote to your cousin Margaret in London. Do you keep copies of your correspondence? No, Your Grace. Paper and ink are precious, and I could never afford such luxury. I write my thoughts once and send them on their way, trusting them to find their destination safely. When did you last write to her? Perhaps 3 weeks past, just after your return from France. I wanted her to know that you had arrived safely and that the household was returning to its normal routines. And in that letter, did you mention anything specific about my travels or diplomatic work? Her cheeks colored slightly, and she lowered her eyes. I fear I may have been too forward in my admiration, Your Grace. I wrote of how honored I felt to serve in the household of someone who worked so diligently for peace between nations. I may have mentioned how fascinating it was to hear about the French court, though I certainly never shared any private information. Rosalind, I said, using her given name for the first time and watching her eyes widen in surprise, I believe someone has used your innocent correspondence to forge evidence against you. Someone who had access to information about my diplomatic work and the skill to create convincing forgeries. The color drained from her face completely. Your Grace, surely you don't mean to suggest that someone in your own household would commit such treachery? I fear that is exactly what I mean to suggest. The question now is how to prove it before Sir Bartholomew arrives to collect you. She was silent for a long moment, and I watched emotions play across her features like shadows from the flickering candles. Fear, certainly, but also something that looked remarkably like determination. Your Grace, she said finally, her voice steady despite the gravity of our conversation, if someone in this household is willing to see me hanged for their crimes, then they pose a danger not just to me, but to you and to England itself. We must find a way to expose them, whatever the cost. In that moment, looking at this remarkable woman who faced death with such courage and concern for others, I felt something shift irrevocably in my heart. This was no longer simply about justice or duty. This was about protecting someone who had become far more precious to me than I had ever dared to acknowledge. The realization of my feelings for Rosalind should have terrified me more than it did. A duke falling in love with a servant was not merely scandalous, it was potentially ruinous to everything my family had built over centuries. Yet as I sat there in the candlelit servants' hall, watching her face reflect both fear and fierce determination, I found myself caring less about social conventions and more about the woman before me. There is something else I must tell you, I said, leaning forward in my chair. Sir Bartholomew Cromwell arrives tomorrow. His reputation for swift justice is well known throughout England. Once he takes custody of a prisoner, their fate is typically sealed within days. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. Then we have little time to uncover the truth. I asked, struck by her use of the word. Your Grace, forgive my presumption, but if you believe in my innocence enough to risk your own position investigating these charges, then surely I can be trusted to assist in my own defense. I know this household as well as anyone. I might notice things that would escape your attention. Her logic was sound, though the danger to both of us was considerable. If we were discovered conducting our own investigation, it could be seen as an admission of guilt or, worse, evidence of a conspiracy between us. Yet time was running short, and I needed every advantage I could gain. Very well, I said, making a decision that felt both reckless and absolutely right. But we must be extraordinarily careful. If anyone suspects what we're doing, it could doom us both. The next few hours were spent in careful planning. Rosalind would continue her normal duties while observing the household staff for any unusual behavior. I would examine the estate's financial records, looking for anything that might explain why someone would risk such treachery. We agreed to meet again after midnight in the library, where our conversation could be disguised as research for my diplomatic correspondence. As the household settled into sleep that night, I made my way to the estate office where Marcus kept detailed records of all household expenditures. Working by lamplight, I began methodically reviewing the accounts from the past 6 months, searching for any irregularities that might provide insight into the mystery we faced. What I discovered sent a chill through my very bones. Over the past year, there had been a series of small but consistent discrepancies in the household accounts. Money allocated for estate repairs that showed no corresponding work completed. Funds designated for staff wages that exceeded what was actually paid. Taken individually, each discrepancy was minor enough to escape notice. Together, they painted a picture of systematic embezzlement. Marcus Whitmore, my trusted steward, had been stealing from my family for months. The amount was not enormous by ducal standards, but it would represent a fortune to a man of his station. More importantly, it provided a motive for the desperate act of framing an innocent woman to cover his crimes. But having a motive was not the same as having proof. I needed evidence that would convince Sir Bartholomew that his investigation had targeted the wrong person. As I sat there surrounded by ledgers and account books, I heard the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Quickly extinguishing my lamp, I moved to the window and peered through the heavy curtains. In the moonlit courtyard below, I could see a figure moving stealthily toward the stables. Even in the dim light, I recognized the careful gait and stooped shoulders of Marcus Whitmore. Grabbing a dark cloak, I slipped from the office and followed at a distance, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Marcus moved with surprising stealth for a man of his age, clearly familiar with this nocturnal routine. He led me not to the stables as I had expected, but to a small stone building that had once served as a dovecot in my grandfather's time. Concealing myself behind a low wall, I watched as Marcus lit a small lantern and began examining what appeared to be a collection of documents hidden within the abandoned structure. From my position, I could see him sorting through papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The wind shifted, carrying voices toward my hiding place. Marcus was not alone. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a man I had never seen before but whose expensive clothing and confident bearing marked him as someone of means. The girl will be collected tomorrow, the stranger was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Once Cromwell has her in custody, this unfortunate business will be concluded. And my payment? Marcus asked, his voice tight with anxiety. As agreed. Enough to purchase that cottage in Yorkshire you've been dreaming of. You've served your purpose well, Whitmore. The French ministers were most appreciative of the information you provided about the Duke's negotiating position. My blood turned to ice in my veins. This was not simply about embezzlement. Marcus had been selling diplomatic secrets to French agents, using his position in my household to betray English interests. Framing Rosalind was merely a convenient way to eliminate suspicion and provide a scapegoat for his treachery. What about the Duke? Marcus asked. He's been asking uncomfortable questions about the evidence against the girl. His reputation for honor works in our favor, the stranger replied with a cold laugh. He would never imagine that his trusted steward could be capable of such deception. By the time he realizes the truth, if he ever does, you'll be long gone and the girl will be nothing but an unpleasant memory. I had heard enough. This was the proof I needed, but I also realized the immediate danger we all faced. If Marcus suspected that his activities had been discovered, he might take desperate action to protect himself. Worse, if this French agent decided that I posed a threat to their operation, my own life could be forfeit. Carefully, I made my way back to the house, my mind racing with the implications of what I had witnessed. The evidence was clear, but presenting it would require careful timing and irrefutable proof. Sir Bartholomew would arrive in the morning expecting to collect the traitor. Instead, I would need to convince him that the real traitor had been operating under his very nose. As agreed, I made my way to the library just after midnight, where I found Rosalind waiting among the shadows cast by towering bookshelves. She had changed from her servant's dress into a simple dark gown that made her nearly invisible in the dim room. When she turned toward me, the moonlight from the tall windows caught her face, and I was struck again by her quiet beauty and the intelligence that shone in her dark eyes. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I fear I have disturbing news. I observed Mr. Whitmore leaving the house tonight, carrying what appeared to be documents. When I checked his office, I discovered that several drawers had been left open, as if he had been hastily gathering important papers. I followed him," I admitted, and proceeded to tell her everything I had witnessed and overheard. As I spoke, I watched her face cycle through expressions of shock, anger, and finally, a grim determination that reminded me why I had come to admire her so deeply. "So he has been selling information to French agents while stealing from your household," she said when I finished. "And tomorrow, Sir Bartholomew will arrive expecting to arrest me for Marcus's crimes." "Yes, but now we have the truth. The question is how to present it in a way that will convince Sir Bartholomew and protect us both from retaliation." She was quiet for a moment, and I could practically see her mind working through the possibilities. "Your Grace, may I ask you something that might seem improper? Given our circumstances, I think propriety has already been thoroughly abandoned," I replied with a rueful smile. "Why are you doing this? You could simply allow Sir Bartholomew to take me and avoid any risk to yourself or your position. Most men of your station would consider a servant's life an acceptable loss to preserve their own comfort." The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. In the moonlit library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, I found myself at a crossroads that would define not just this crisis, but the rest of my life. "Because," I said, stepping closer to her, "somewhere between your first day in this household and this moment, you stopped being merely a servant to me. You became something far more precious, something I cannot bear to lose." Her breath caught audibly, and in the silver light streaming through the windows, I saw tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "Your Grace, you cannot mean what I think you mean." "Can I not?" I asked softly. "Tomorrow may bring disaster for us both. Tonight, I find myself caring less about the consequences and more about the truth. The truth is that I have fallen in love with your courage, your intelligence, your unwavering integrity. If that makes me a fool, then so be it." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stood there in the moonlit library, the weight of my confession settling between us like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand in mine. "If loving you makes me a fool as well," she whispered, "then I am content to be the greatest fool in all of England." The touch of her hand in mine sent warmth flooding through my entire being, as if the autumn chill that had settled deep in my bones suddenly gave way to the promise of spring. In that moonlit library, surrounded by volumes that chronicled centuries of human wisdom and folly, we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Whatever happened with Sir Bartholomew's arrival, whatever consequences we might face, this moment of truth between us would remain untainted by the deceptions swirling around us. But even as my heart soared with the joy of mutual confession, my mind could not abandon the practical realities we faced. Dawn was only hours away, and with it would come Sir Bartholomew Cromwell and his cold determination to see justice done according to his understanding of the facts. "Rosalind," I said, reluctantly releasing her hand though every fiber of my being wanted to hold her closer, "we must focus on the immediate danger. I have a plan, but it will require both courage and precise timing." She nodded, her expression shifting back to the determined focus that had impressed me from our first conversation about the accusations. "Tell me what you need me to do. When Sir Bartholomew arrives, I will present him with the evidence of Marcus's embezzlement. However, I suspect Marcus will deny everything and attempt to shift blame. We need irrefutable proof of his treachery, evidence that cannot be dismissed or explained away." "The papers he was examining tonight," she said immediately. "If we could retrieve them before he has a chance to destroy them." "Exactly. But the risk is enormous. If Marcus discovers us, or if that French agent is still nearby, we could find ourselves in mortal danger." Her chin lifted in that stubborn gesture I had come to recognize. "Your Grace, I have spent the last 3 days believing I would hang for treason. The possibility of danger in pursuit of truth seems a fair trade for the certainty of death in the service of lies." Her words reminded me again why I had fallen so completely under her spell. This was a woman who faced adversity with grace and met challenges with intelligence and bravery. In another time, another place, she would have been recognized as the remarkable person she was regardless of her birth. In our world, such recognition would have to be fought for and won. "Very well," I said, making my decision. "We go together, now, while the household sleeps. If we're discovered, I'll claim I was investigating suspicious activity on my own property. You were merely accompanying me for safety." The excuse was thin, but it was better than nothing. We made our way through the darkened corridors of the house, moving carefully to avoid the creaking floorboards I had learned to navigate during childhood adventures. The familiar weight of the house seemed different now, charged with danger and possibility in equal measure. The night air was bitter cold when we slipped from the house, our breath forming small clouds in the moonlight. Frost was beginning to form on the grass, making our footsteps crunch softly as we made our way toward the abandoned dovecot. I carried a small lantern, keeping it shuttered until we reached our destination. The stone building stood silent and seemingly empty in the moonlight. As we approached, I motioned for Rosalind to remain hidden while I checked for any signs of occupancy. The structure appeared deserted, but I could see that the heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, just as Marcus had left it. Inside, we found a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded my most optimistic hopes. Hidden within a false bottom of an old wooden chest were dozens of documents, correspondence with French agents, detailed accounts of diplomatic conversations I had shared in confidence, and most damning of all, receipts for payments received in exchange for information. "My God," Rosalind whispered as we examined the papers by lantern light. "He's been betraying English interests for over a year. The information here could have influenced the outcome of your negotiations in France." But it was another discovery that truly shocked me. Among the papers was a letter in Marcus's own handwriting, detailing a plan to frame one of the household staff for treason should suspicion ever fall upon him. The letter specifically mentioned Rosalind by name, describing her as the perfect scapegoat due to her education and her correspondence with relatives in London. "He planned this," I said, my voice tight with fury. "This was not a desperate improvisation. He selected you deliberately, knowing your background would make the accusations believable. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. Marcus had been willing to see an innocent woman hang not only to cover his embezzlement but to protect his espionage activities. The depth of his betrayal went far beyond mere greed, it was a fundamental rejection of every principle of honor and loyalty that should have bound him to my family." We gathered the most incriminating documents, leaving the rest undisturbed so that Marcus would not immediately realize his secret cache had been discovered. As we prepared to leave, however, we heard the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path outside. I quickly shuttered the lantern and motioned for Rosalind to conceal herself behind the old chest. Through a crack in the wooden door, I could see 2 figures approaching, Marcus and the same French agent I had observed earlier. Their conversation was heated, though they kept their voices low. "The Duke is becoming suspicious," Marcus was saying, his voice tight with anxiety. "He questioned me extensively about the evidence, and I fear he may not simply accept the girl's guilt as we hoped." "Then perhaps we need to ensure his cooperation through more direct means," the French agent replied coldly. "A tragic accident could befall the Duke before he has a chance to interfere with our carefully laid plans." The casual way he spoke of murdering me sent ice through my veins. This was no longer simply about framing Rosalind, these men were prepared to kill to protect their conspiracy. I cannot be party to harming the Duke, Marcus protested, though his voice lacked conviction. I have served his family for decades. There must be another way. Your sentimental attachments are precisely why you were never more than a tool in this operation, the agent said with disdain. However, if you prefer, we can simply eliminate both potential problems. The Duke and the girl could both suffer unfortunate accidents tonight, leaving Sir Bartholomew to investigate a clear case of treason followed by a tragic conclusion. I felt Rosalind tense beside me in the darkness. The situation had escalated beyond anything I had anticipated. These men were not merely willing to frame an innocent woman, they were prepared to commit multiple murders to protect their operation. But even as fear coursed through me, I realized we now had an unprecedented opportunity. If I could somehow capture or expose these men in the act of planning murder, it would provide irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy and completely vindicate Rosalind. The challenge was how to accomplish this without getting ourselves killed in the process. We were unarmed, outnumbered, and trapped in a confined space with limited means of escape. Yet as I looked at Rosalind's face in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls, I saw not fear but determination. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. Your Grace, she whispered so quietly I could barely hear her, the old bell in the tower. If you could reach it, the sound would wake the entire household and bring help. She was right. The bell tower stood only 50 yards away, a remnant of the ancient monastery that had once occupied this land. If I could reach it and ring the alarm, it would not only summon assistance but also alert the entire countryside to danger. But that would mean leaving you here alone with these men, I whispered back. I can take care of myself for a few minutes, she replied with a confidence that both impressed and terrified me. Besides, they need me alive to maintain their story. You are the one in immediate danger. As if to underscore her point, we heard the French agent speak again, his voice now carrying clear menace. Enough debate, Whitmore. The Duke dies tonight, along with the girl. Make your peace with it, or join them in whatever afterlife awaits traitors and fools. The time for hesitation had passed. I squeezed Rosalind's hand once, a silent promise that I would return for her, and began moving carefully toward the back of the dovecot where I remembered there was a small window that faced away from where the men stood. The ancient window frame protested silently as I carefully worked it open, the old wood swollen with decades of dampness and neglect. Every creak seemed thunderous in the stillness, but the voices outside continued their deadly planning, masking any sound I might have made. As I slipped through the narrow opening, I caught one last glimpse of Rosalind's face, pale but resolute in the darkness, and felt my heart clench with both love and terror. The sprint to the bell tower felt like the longest 50 yards of my life. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, every sound amplified by my racing pulse. The tower's ancient stones were slick with frost, making the climb treacherous, but desperation lent strength to my limbs. When I finally grasped the heavy rope and pulled with all my might, the great bronze bell's voice shattered the night with a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The effect was immediate and profound. Lights began appearing in windows throughout the manor house, and I could hear voices calling out in alarm. More importantly, I heard shouts of confusion and anger from the direction of the dovecot. My plan was working, but now came the truly dangerous part, getting back to Rosalind before Marcus and his French collaborator could harm her or escape. I descended the tower with reckless speed, my hands raw from the rough stone, and ran toward the dovecot just as the first of my household staff came stumbling from the house, hastily dressed and carrying lanterns. What I found when I reached the stone building made my blood run cold. The door hung open, and inside I could hear the sound of a struggle. Without hesitation, I burst through the entrance to find Marcus holding Rosalind roughly by the arm while the French agent pressed a dagger to her throat. Her dark eyes met mine across the small space, and even in her terror, I saw relief flood her features. How touching, the agent said with cold amusement, his blade reflecting the lantern light. The Duke arrives just in time to watch his beloved servant pay for his meddling. Release her, I commanded, though I was acutely aware that I had no weapon and no leverage save for the approaching voices of my household staff. Your plan has failed. The evidence of your conspiracy is already in safe hands, and half the county will be here within minutes. Marcus's face was a mask of desperation and shame. Your Grace, please understand, I never meant for it to come to this. The debts, the pressures, they offered so much money, and it seemed harmless at first, just sharing a few details about your conversations. Harmless? I replied, my voice carrying all the fury and disappointment I felt. You were prepared to see an innocent woman hanged to cover your treachery. You call that harmless? The French agent's patience was clearly wearing thin. Enough of this sentiment. The girl dies now, and you with her if necessary. Whitmore, take his Grace's pistol. But Marcus made no move to obey. Instead, his weathered face crumpled with shame and regret. No, he said quietly, then louder, no, I will not be party to murder. I am a thief and a traitor, but I am not a killer. In that moment of defiance, everything changed. The agent's attention shifted momentarily to Marcus, and Rosalind, with courage that took my breath away, brought her elbow back sharply into her captor's ribs. The man cursed and stumbled, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. I launched myself forward, tackling the agent as he tried to regain his balance. We crashed to the stone floor in a tangle of limbs, the dagger spinning away into the darkness. He was stronger than I had expected, and younger, but I had the advantage of righteous fury and the desperate need to protect the woman I loved. The fight was brief but vicious. Just as I began to worry that I might not prevail, the dovecot filled with the light of multiple lanterns as my household staff arrived, led by Mrs. Henley brandishing a heavy iron skillet and followed by several of my groundskeepers carrying various improvised weapons. The French agent, seeing himself outnumbered and his mission failed, ceased his struggles. Marcus slumped against the wall, looking every one of his 60 years and more, the weight of his betrayals finally too heavy to bear. Bind them both, I ordered, getting to my feet and immediately moving to Rosalind's side. She was shaken but unharmed, and when I took her hands in mine, I felt the tremor of reaction setting in. You were magnificent, I whispered to her, my voice rough with emotion and relief. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Sir Bartholomew Cromwell arrived with the dawn, his small retinue expecting to collect a confessed traitor and instead finding a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple case of domestic treason. When presented with the documentary evidence we had gathered and the testimony of multiple witnesses to the night's events, even his skeptical nature was convinced. Marcus, perhaps hoping for some mercy in exchange for cooperation, confessed everything. The French had been paying him for information for over a year, using his reports to undermine English negotiating positions. The embezzlement had been a separate crime, born of gambling debts and poor investments. When he realized discovery was inevitable, the plan to frame Rosalind had seemed like the perfect solution to multiple problems. And what of Miss Ashworth? Sir Bartholomew asked as we stood in my study, the morning sun streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the documents spread across my desk. Miss Ashworth is completely innocent of any wrongdoing, I replied firmly. She was selected as a scapegoat precisely because her education and correspondence made her seem credible as a suspect. In truth, she showed remarkable courage in helping to expose the real conspiracy. Sir Bartholomew studied me carefully, his sharp eyes noting details I wished he wouldn't. And your interest in her innocence? Purely a matter of justice, Your Grace. The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment of truth, not just about the conspiracy but about my own intentions. I could deflect, make some comment about duty to my household staff, and preserve the comfortable fiction that nothing had changed. Or I could have the courage that Rosalind had shown throughout this ordeal. Sir Bartholomew, I said, meeting his gaze directly, Miss Ashworth will soon become my wife, if she will have me. My interest in her welfare is both a matter of justice and a matter of the heart. His eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Your wife. Your Grace, surely you understand the scandal such a union would create. I understand perfectly, I replied calmly. I also understand that scandal fades, but regret lasts forever. I have found a woman of remarkable intelligence, courage, and integrity. Her birth is humble, but her character is noble. That seems to me an excellent foundation for marriage. Later that morning, as Sir Bartholomew's party departed with their prisoners, I found Rosalind in the garden where she often worked, tending to the late autumn flowers that had somehow survived the recent frosts. She looked up as I approached, her face reflecting the same mixture of relief and uncertainty that I felt. Is it truly over? She asked softly. The danger is past, I assured her, taking her hands in mine as I had longed to do since that first night in the library. Marcus and his French confederate will face justice, your name is completely cleared, and the real conspiracy has been exposed. And what happens now? She asked, though I thought I detected hope beneath her carefully neutral tone. I dropped to one knee there among the frost-touched roses, holding her hands and looking up into the face that had become more precious to me than all the titles and properties I had inherited. Now, I said, I ask the most important question of my life. Rosalind Ashworth, will you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife? Will you take the name Harrington and help me build a life based on truth, justice, and love rather than convention and expectation. Tears sparkled in her dark eyes, but her smile was radiant as the morning sun. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Cedric, with all my heart. 6 months later, we were married in a simple ceremony in the village church, surrounded by friends who had come to understand that true nobility lies not in bloodlines but in character. Our union raised eyebrows in some circles, but it also inspired others to look beyond the artificial barriers that society creates. Rosalind brought to our marriage not only her love but her intelligence and education, becoming my partner in ways that went far beyond the traditional role of a duchess. Together, we worked to reform some of the injustices we had witnessed, using our position to help others who found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. As I stand now on that same moonlit balcony where this story began, watching my wife read by candlelight in our study below, I am reminded daily of the truth we learned during those dangerous autumn nights. Real love requires courage, the courage to see beyond appearances, to fight for what is right, and to choose the difficult path when it leads to something precious and true. Sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in the places we expect to look, but in the quiet corners where genuine hearts reside, waiting for someone brave enough to recognize their worth. On that moonlit balcony, when I touched the hand of the maid accused of treason and she did not pull away, we both discovered that love, like justice, is worth any risk when the cause is true. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to hear more tales of love, courage, and the triumph of truth over deception. After all, the greatest adventures are often found not in distant lands, but in the courage to follow our hearts wherever they may lead.